Here's something that doesn't make sense about the 1943 Aleutian campaign. When you study the Japanese withdrawal from Attu and Kiska, the official narrative talks about American amphibious assaults, artillery bombardments, and the brutal island-hopping strategy. But there's a gap in the timeline that nobody talks about. Between February and May 1943, Japanese garrison strength on Kiska dropped by nearly 40% before the main American assault even began. Not from naval bombardment, those are documented. Not from air raids, those left physical evidence. Japanese soldiers simply started disappearing from their posts in numbers that made their commanders file reports describing unexplained personnel losses in extreme weather conditions. One of those reports, translated after the war and immediately classified, described something strange. A Japanese lieutenant wrote that his men were reporting ghost hunters in the fog, figures that appeared and vanished in the whiteout conditions, soldiers who claimed to see movement in blizzards where visibility was zero, equipment failures that seemed deliberate but left no evidence of sabotage. The lieutenant attributed it to psychological stress from isolation and cold. But 3 days after he filed that report, his entire observation post, 12 men, vanished during a storm. They were found a week later, frozen to death 3 miles from their fortified position, scattered across the tundra, as if they'd fled in different directions from something they couldn't identify. What if I told you there was an American unit operating in the Aleutians that never appears in any official order of battle? A unit composed entirely of Alaskan Native men, Unangan, Yupik, and Inupiat, who were recruited specifically because they possessed knowledge that no military training could replicate. Men who understood how to survive in conditions that killed trained soldiers in hours, who could navigate in zero-visibility storms, who knew how to weaponize cold itself against an enemy that had no cultural framework for that kind of environment. Before I show you what I've found, declassified weather station logs with annotations that don't match official personnel records, VA psychiatric files from the 1950s describing Alaskan Native veterans with Arctic combat syndrome treated at classification levels that didn't officially exist, and testimony from elders in remote villages who remember family members who went south for winter war training and came back unable to speak about what they'd done. I need something from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe right now, because this video has already been demonetized twice. The algorithm flagged it as unverified historical claims. Apparently, telling stories that contradict the official narrative gets you suppressed. Your subscription is what keeps this research alive. December 14th, 1942. A coded message arrived at Fort Richardson in Anchorage from the War Department. It requested a confidential meeting with village councils from 3 different Alaskan Native communities, specifically requesting elders with traditional cold weather survival expertise. The message was classified restricted, which was unusual for what appeared to be a cultural consultation. Within a week, representatives from Unalaska, Bethel, and Barrow had made the journey, some traveling over 500 miles in winter conditions. They met with 3 Army officers whose names were redacted from every document related to the meeting. What was discussed would never appear in official military records. But we know what happened next. Within 2 months, 47 Alaskan Native men between the ages of 19 and 35 had enlisted in a program that had no official designation. They were told they'd be serving in Arctic reconnaissance operations. They were promised regular military pay plus hazard compensation. and they were required to sign documents that classified everything about their service, including the fact that they were serving at all. The native cold-weather Rangers had just been born, and the Japanese forces occupying the Aleutian Islands were about to face something that no amount of military training had prepared them for. Men who didn't just survive the Arctic, they used it as a weapon. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the strategic crisis that made the U.S. military desperate enough to try something that violated every principle of modern warfare. We need to understand what happens when conventional forces fail in an environment that's more lethal than the enemy. 42. It had become America's most embarrassing strategic failure when Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska in June of that year. It marked the first time since the War of 1812 that foreign troops had occupied American soil. The propaganda value alone was devastating, but the real problem was tactical. Nobody knew how to fight effectively in the Arctic. The Aleutians weren't like the Pacific Islands, where the Marines were developing their doctrine. They were a 1,200-mile volcanic archipelago wrapped in near-constant fog, battered by winds that could reach 100 miles per hour, with temperatures that could drop to 20 below zero. Visibility was frequently zero. Equipment froze and became useless. Men developed frostbite during summer months. The terrain was too rough for vehicles, too exposed for aircraft, and so consistently socked in with weather that naval support was unreliable at best. The initial American response had been conventional: assemble a force, transport them to the islands, and overwhelm the Japanese with superior numbers. But the first reconnaissance missions were disasters. Patrols sent to assess Japanese positions either got lost in the fog and had to be rescued, or were pinned down by weather for days, returning with frostbite casualties and almost no useful intelligence. One patrol of 12 men spent 4 days trying to advance 3 miles, lost 2 men to hypothermia, and never made visual contact with the enemy. The Japanese, meanwhile, weren't doing much better. Their troops were suffering terribly from the cold. They'd been equipped for Pacific Island warfare, not Arctic conditions. But they were dug in, fortified, and the weather protected them more effectively than any defensive position. American commanders were looking at casualty projections that suggested taking back the islands would cost thousands of lives, most of them to the environment rather than enemy action. In October 1942, a planning meeting at the Alaskan Defense Command in Anchorage devolved into what one participant later described as controlled panic. Conventional assault plans kept coming back with unacceptable casualty estimates. The Navy couldn't provide reliable support because of the weather. The Air Force couldn't maintain consistent reconnaissance, and nobody had solved the fundamental problem. How do you fight effectively when you can't see, can't move, and can't survive outside for more than a few hours? A junior intelligence officer named Captain James Horvath, who'd spent 2 years stationed in Alaska before the war, made a suggestion that initially seemed absurd. "The native population survives here year-round," he said. "Some of them have been hunting and traveling in these conditions for their entire lives. What if we asked them how they do it?" The response was dismissive at first. This was modern warfare. Indigenous survival techniques were interesting anthropologically, but hardly relevant to military operations. But Horvath pushed back with a question nobody could answer. How many of our men have died from cold in the last 4 months versus enemy action? The answer was classified, but everyone in the room knew it. Environmental casualties were outpacing combat casualties by a factor of 5 to 1. That's when the conversation shifted, not to incorporating native guides or cultural consultants in a conventional support role, but to something far more radical. What if they recruited men who already possessed the skills that were killing American soldiers, trained them in just enough military tactics to make them effective, and deployed them as a specialized unit designed specifically for Arctic warfare? It was unprecedented. It was potentially politically explosive, and it was approved within 3 weeks, with the explicit understanding that if it failed, or if it succeeded using methods that were too unconventional, the entire program would be buried so deep that no historian would ever find it. Captain Horvath arrived in Unalaska on January the 9th, 1943, accompanied by a civilian anthropologist named Dr. Raymond Chen and a Yunangan translator named Michael Borenin. They didn't arrive in uniform or with official military vehicles. They came on a supply boat, dressed in civilian cold-weather gear, looking more like researchers than recruiters. The approach was deliberate. The Alaskan Native communities had complicated relationships with federal authority, generations of broken promises, forced relocations, and cultural suppression. Simply showing up and demanding volunteers would fail. So Horvath took a different approach. He told the truth. At a community gathering in a Russian Orthodox church that served as the village meeting hall, Horvath explained the situation plainly. "We're losing men to the cold faster than we're losing them to the Japanese," he said through Borenin's translation. "Our soldiers don't know how to survive out there. You do. We need people who can teach us, or better yet, who can operate where our conventional forces can't." An elder named Sergei Sovorov asked the obvious question. "Why should we help? The government took our children to boarding schools to beat the native out of them. Now, you want the native back because it's useful?" Horvath didn't deflect. "You're right, and I can't promise this will change anything about how you're treated after the war. But right now, Japanese forces are occupying American territory, and they're planning to use these islands as staging areas for attacks on the mainland. This isn't abstract. It's your waters, your islands. I'm asking if you're willing to fight for them using the skills you already have." The response wasn't immediate. The community debated for 3 days. Some argued that this was exactly the kind of exploitation they'd endured for generations, being valued only when useful, discarded when not. Others pointed out that the Japanese occupation directly threatened their traditional fishing and hunting grounds, that foreign control of the Aleutians would devastate their way of life, regardless of who won the larger war. Eventually, 7 men from Unalaska volunteered, not out of patriotism to a government that had marginalized them, but out of a more fundamental calculation. These were their islands, and they'd rather fight on their own terms than wait to see what happened if they did nothing. The recruitment pattern repeated in other communities. In Bethel, 14 Yupik men volunteered, primarily young hunters who'd grown up traveling the tundra in conditions that would kill outsiders. In Barrow, 9 Inupiat men signed on, several of them experienced whalers who understood ice, weather patterns, and navigation in environments of total whiteout. But the recruitment came with requirements that made many uncomfortable. The volunteers had to agree to leave their communities immediately. They had to sign documents, in English, which many couldn't read fluently, that prohibited them from discussing their service with anyone, including family. They had to accept that their traditional knowledge would be documented, studied, and potentially taught to non-native soldiers. One recruit, a Yupik hunter named Paul Nikolai, asked what would happen to the knowledge after the war. "Will you give it back or keep it?" The answer he received was bureaucratic and evasive. "All training materials will be classified for national security purposes." Nikolai signed anyway. So did 40 others, not because they trusted the promises, but because they understood the alternative was watching others fight for land they knew better than any outsider ever could. By February 1943, 47 Alaskan Native men had been quietly transferred to a location that officially didn't exist, a training camp in the interior mountains where they would spend the next 3 months being transformed from hunters and fishermen into something the military had never created before: Arctic ghosts. The training facility was located in a valley 70 miles from Fairbanks, accessible only by bush plane and deliberately isolated from any established military installation. There were no barracks, no parade grounds, no signs of conventional military infrastructure, just a few canvas tents, a supply cache, and miles of frozen wilderness. The training doctrine was unlike anything in U.S. Army field manuals because it inverted the normal process. Instead of teaching soldiers to survive in harsh conditions, the instructors, a mix of Army cold weather specialists and the native recruits themselves, focused on teaching how to weaponize those conditions against an enemy. The core curriculum wasn't about military tactics. It was about invisibility, patience, and environmental mastery. The recruits, already experts in Arctic survival, were asked to refine those skills into operational capabilities. They practiced moving across snow and ice without leaving readable tracks, using wind patterns, strategic stepping on rock outcrops, and techniques passed down through generations. They learned to navigate in zero-visibility conditions using environmental cues that conventional soldiers never noticed: wind direction against exposed skin, the sound of surf in fog, the way ice formations indicated proximity to water or land. But the most unsettling training focused on what the documentation obliquely refers to as environmental psychological operations. The instructors realized that the native recruits understood something profound. In the Arctic, the mind fails before the body. Cold isn't just physical, it's psychological. It creates fear, disorientation, and irrational decision-making. The training exploited this. Recruits practiced techniques for inducing hypothermic confusion in targets, creating situations where enemy soldiers would make fatal decisions out of cold-induced panic. They studied how to disable heating equipment in ways that looked like mechanical failure rather than sabotage. They learned to use weather as cover for approaches and retreats that would be impossible in normal visibility. One exercise involved stalking instructors playing the role of enemy sentries during a blizzard. The recruits succeeded not by overpowering them, but by using the environment to create auditory and visual hallucinations, appearing and disappearing in the swirling snow, creating sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions, inducing the kind of disorientation that makes even trained soldiers abandon their posts. A training observer, an Army captain named Douglas Merritt, assigned to document the program, wrote in a report dated March 15, 1943, "These men are not operating as conventional soldiers. They have internalized the environment to a degree that makes them nearly undetectable." During a training scenario yesterday, I was tasked with locating a 4-man team in a designated valley. I spent 6 hours searching and found nothing. When I returned to base, I was informed the team had been within 50 meters of me for the entire exercise, observing my movements. I never saw them, never heard them, never sensed their presence. If the objective had been elimination rather than observation, I would have been a casualty without ever knowing I was in danger. The training also included basic military skills, weapons handling, radio operation, combat medicine. But these were secondary to the primary capability: becoming invisible predators in an environment where the enemy was already struggling to survive. By April 1943, the native cold weather Rangers were ready for deployment. They had been transformed from civilians with traditional skills into a specialized unit that the U.S. military had no doctrine for and no intention of ever publicly acknowledging. The only question remaining was whether they could achieve in combat what they demonstrated in training. The answer would come in the fog-shrouded islands of the Aleutians, where Japanese soldiers were about to encounter something they had no framework to understand.
On April 20th, 1943, an element
Of the native cold weather Rangers inserted onto Kiska Island under cover of fog so dense that the Navy transport barely managed the approach. The team, led by an Unangan hunter named Alexei Gromov, carried minimal equipment, no heavy weapons, no explosives, nothing that would identify them as American military if captured. Their objective was simple: assess Japanese defensive positions and, if opportunity presented, reduce enemy morale through unconventional means. The Japanese garrison on Kiska numbered approximately 5,400 troops, dug into an extensive network of bunkers and tunnels. They were well supplied, well armed, and positioned in terrain that made conventional assault nearly suicidal. But they were all suffering. Supply ships were being sunk by American submarines. The weather was grinding down their equipment and their psychological resilience, and they were isolated, occupying a barren volcanic island in constant fog, surrounded by an ocean that was increasingly controlled by enemy forces. The Rangers didn't attack Japanese positions directly. Instead, they began what their operation summary would later describe as environmental disruption operations. Over the course of 2 weeks, they systematically exploited the conditions that were already breaking Japanese morale. They contaminated fuel supplies with water, creating failures that looked like condensation or poor storage rather than sabotage. They damaged radio antennas in ways that appeared to be weather-related. They removed critical components from generators and heating equipment, not destroying them, just taking small parts that would cause mysterious failures. But the psychological operations were more devastating. The Rangers used their knowledge of sound and fog to create acoustic effects that terrified Japanese sentries, voices in the mist that seemed to come from nowhere, footsteps that approached and then vanished, equipment that moved during shifts suggesting that positions were being infiltrated even though no one could explain how. A Japanese diary, recovered after the island was retaken and translated before being classified, describes the mounting paranoia. May 7th, 3 more men have requested relief from perimeter duty, claiming they are being watched by something they cannot see. Lieutenant Oda dismissed this as weather-induced hallucination, but I have heard the sounds myself. Movement in the fog where nothing should be. The Americans cannot be operating in these conditions. No one can. yet someone is out there. By mid-May, the Japanese garrison on Kiska was experiencing a breakdown in discipline that their commanders couldn't explain. Sentries were abandoning posts. Soldiers were refusing to go outside during storms. Equipment failures were mounting to statistically impossible levels, and men were reporting psychological symptoms, auditory hallucinations, paranoia, the conviction that they were being hunted by something that wasn't quite human. The Rangers achieved their objective without firing a shot. They created an environment where the Japanese were fighting not just American forces, but the island itself, where every mechanical failure felt like sabotage, every strange sound in the fog felt like an approaching threat, and the isolation became unbearable. A captured Japanese intelligence report from June 1943 recommended immediate evacuation of Kiska, citing unsustainable psychological deterioration among garrison personnel due to environmental stress and suspected enemy infiltration using unknown methodology. When American forces finally assaulted Kiska in August 1943, they found the island abandoned. The Japanese had evacuated under cover of fog, not because they'd been defeated militarily, but because they'd been psychologically broken by an enemy they never fully identified. The operation was classified as a complete success. The native cold weather Rangers had proven their capability beyond any doubt, but that success created a problem. Explaining how a handful of men achieved what thousands of conventional troops could not, without revealing methods that violated every principle of modern warfare. The Rangers were about to learn that being too effective is sometimes worse than failing. By September 1943, elements of the native cold weather Rangers had been quietly transferred to the European theater. The official records show no such transfer, no transport manifests, no unit designations, no deployment orders. But fragmentary evidence suggests that at least 15 Rangers were operating in northern Norway by October, embedded with British commando operations targeting German installations above the Arctic Circle. The strategic situation in Norway was critical. German forces controlled the coast, threatening Allied Arctic convoys to Murmansk. They'd fortified key positions with troops experienced in winter warfare, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front who'd survived Russian winters. These weren't garrison troops who could be easily intimidated. They were hardened soldiers who knew cold, who understood mountain warfare, and who were dug into positions that conventional raids couldn't dislodge without massive casualties. The Rangers operated differently than they had in the Aleutians. Here, they weren't the primary force, but a supporting element, inserted ahead of British commando raids to conduct what operational summaries called pre-assault environmental preparation. What that actually meant was psychological warfare designed to create maximum confusion and fear before conventional forces engaged. The Rangers would infiltrate German-held territory during the months-long Arctic night, when darkness was nearly constant and weather conditions were extreme even by Norwegian standards. They targeted isolated outposts first, observation stations, communication relays, supply depots, not with direct attacks, but with methods that exploited the German soldiers' fear of the Arctic environment. Equipment would fail mysteriously. Sentries would report seeing movement in the darkness that vanished when investigated. Soldiers on perimeter duty would disappear, sometimes found days later, alive but disoriented, claiming they'd been pursued by something they couldn't identify and had fled into the wilderness to escape. One German report, recovered from a coastal observation station and translated after the war, described an incident in January 1944. 3 separate sentries on successive nights have reported hearing what they describe as breathing in the darkness outside the perimeter. Each claimed the sound moved around the position, circling as if something was studying our defenses. When searchlights were used, nothing was visible. Morale among the men is deteriorating. They believe something is stalking the position. The installation was abandoned a week later, despite being strategically valuable and well supplied. The commanding officer reported unsustainable psychological stress among his troops and recommended relocation to a position with better visibility and fewer approaches. The pattern repeated across northern Norway. German positions that should have been held were being voluntarily abandoned. Troops were requesting transfers south. Psychological casualties were mounting, men reporting symptoms consistent with extreme stress and paranoia, claiming they were being hunted by forces they couldn't see or understand. British intelligence officers who worked alongside the Rangers during this period left fragmentary accounts that were immediately classified. One officer, whose name is redacted from the surviving documents, wrote, "The American irregular unit operating in our sector achieves results through methods I cannot ethically describe in an official report. They exploit indigenous survival techniques and environmental psychology to create terror rather than inflict casualties. The Germans are not being defeated, they are being driven mad. I have requested reassignment." By March 1944, the native cold weather Rangers had contributed to the collapse or withdrawal of 17 German positions in northern Norway without engaging in direct combat. Their effectiveness was undeniable, but reports from Allied personnel who witnessed their operations were becoming problematic. Questions were being raised at higher command levels about methods, about oversight, and about what exactly these men were doing in the darkness of the Arctic night that was proving so devastatingly effective. And in warfare, questions about methods usually lead to one outcome: suppression of evidence and elimination of the capability that created the questions in the first place. The meeting that ended the native cold weather Rangers took place on April 8, 1944, in a secure conference room at the Combined Operations Headquarters in London. No minutes were kept, but cross-referenced documents suggest attendees included representatives from U.S. Army Intelligence, British Special Operations Executive, and at least one State Department liaison. The immediate trigger was a British after-action report from a joint operation in Norway. A commando team had been inserted to destroy a German radar installation, supported by a 4-man Ranger element conducting advance reconnaissance. The raid succeeded, but the British commanding officer filed a detailed complaint about the Rangers' methods. His report described finding German sentries who had abandoned their posts and fled into the wilderness, equipment deliberately disabled in ways designed to create maximum psychological impact, and evidence of what he called calculated torment, rather than tactical necessity. "These men are not conducting military operations," he wrote. "They are conducting psychological torture using environmental conditions as the weapon. I cannot in good conscience participate in operations that employ such methods." The complaint forced a review of the entire Rangers program. When intelligence officers compiled a comprehensive assessment of their operations, Aleutians, Norway, and several classified incidents in other theaters, a disturbing pattern emerged. The Rangers were extraordinarily effective at achieving objectives with minimal resources and 0 American casualties, but their methods consistently violated accepted standards of warfare. They induced hypothermia deliberately. They created psychological conditions designed to cause enemy soldiers to make fatal decisions. They exploited cultural and environmental fears in ways that caused lasting trauma. And they did all of this using techniques that left no forensic evidence, making it impossible to investigate or document their actions in ways that would satisfy international law. A State Department representative framed the core problem. If any evidence of these operations becomes public, we hand our enemies a propaganda victory that undermines our entire moral position. We've positioned ourselves as fighting a civilized war against barbarism. These methods are indistinguishable from torture. They're effective, but they're politically catastrophic if exposed. The military representatives argued for continuation based on results. The Rangers had achieved objectives that would have cost hundreds of conventional casualties. They'd collapsed enemy morale in sectors deemed unwinnable. They were saving American lives. But the political calculus was clear. The war was turning in the Allies' favor. The methods that had seemed necessary during desperate times were becoming liabilities as victory approached. There would be tribunals, investigations, international oversight, and unconventional operations that couldn't be easily explained or justified would become massive vulnerabilities. The decision was reached within 2 hours. Immediate termination of the Native Cold Weather Rangers program, complete classification of all operational records, and dispersal of personnel with comprehensive non-disclosure agreements backed by criminal penalties. One attendee, identified in fragmentary references only as Colonel M., asked what would happen to the men themselves. The answer was bureaucratic and cold. Medical separations where appropriate, reassignment to non-combat roles, enforcement of silence through whatever means necessary. These men did exactly what we asked, the colonel said, which is exactly why they cannot be allowed to speak about it, came the reply. Within 1 week, every Native Cold Weather Ranger still in service was pulled from operations. Within 2 weeks, their service records had been altered to remove any reference to the unit. Within a month, the program had been erased as if it had never existed. The men who had been too effective for their own good were about to learn that loyalty to a nation doesn't guarantee that nation's loyalty in return. Alexei Gromov returned to Unalaska in August 1944 with an honorable discharge, a modest pension, and documents that listed his service as weather observation and cold climate research. There was no mention of Kiska, no record of the operations that had helped force a Japanese evacuation, no acknowledgement of the months he'd spent in Norwegian darkness, breaking enemy positions that conventional forces couldn't touch. He tried to resume his life. He went back to fishing, married, started a family. But the transition was impossible in ways he couldn't articulate. He'd spent months operating in conditions where survival itself was an act of predation, where every skill his grandfather had taught him about reading weather and moving silently through ice had been weaponized into something darker. The nightmares weren't about violence. He'd barely fired his weapon in combat. They were about the faces of German soldiers he'd watched through scopes as they abandoned positions in panic, fleeing into conditions that would kill them, about the knowledge that he'd used sacred survival techniques, knowledge meant to preserve life in harsh conditions, to destroy the will to live in others. In 1951, he tried to speak about his service during a village council meeting, thinking that enough time had passed, that the war was over, and the secrets no longer mattered. Within 3 days, 2 men in civilian clothes arrived in Unalaska. They reminded him of the documents he'd signed. They showed him the federal statute that classified violation as a criminal act. They explained, politely but firmly, that continuing to speak would result in prosecution and imprisonment. Gromov never mentioned his service again. When he died in 1979, his obituary listed him as a fisherman and World War II veteran. Nothing more. The pattern repeated across Alaska. Paul Nikolai, the Yupik hunter who'd asked about what would happen to the knowledge after the war, was committed to a VA psychiatric facility in 1948 with a diagnosis of severe Arctic stress syndrome. The treatment he received focused not on healing, but on ensuring silence, a combination of medication and therapeutic techniques designed to suppress rather than process his experiences. He was released in 1950, functionally broken, and lived in near-total isolation until his death in 1967. Others simply vanished from record. Henry Malavansky's service file ends abruptly in May 1944 with a transfer order to a unit that doesn't appear in any Army registry. No discharge papers, no medical records, no death certificate. His family was told he'd died in service, but was given no details, no remains, no explanation. When they requested his service records in 1962, they were informed that the files had been destroyed in a warehouse fire, a fire that no other documentation confirms ever happened. The institutional erasure was so complete that by the 1960s, even veterans who'd served in Alaska during the same period had no knowledge of the Rangers' existence. The operations that had shortened the Aleutian campaign and contributed to German withdrawals in Norway had been attributed to conventional forces or left unexplained in historical records. The men who had weaponized their ancestral knowledge, who had achieved what military doctrine said was impossible, who had served with absolute loyalty despite generations of broken federal promises, these men were denied the one thing that might have made their service bearable, the simple acknowledgement that it had happened. They were heroes classified into non-existence, warriors whose victories were stolen, men who'd saved lives by methods too dark to celebrate and too effective to ever admit.
In 2008, student named Nina
A college searching climate change impacts on traditional Alaskan Native subsistence practices when she found something unexpected in the National Archives. She was reviewing historical weather station data from the Aleutians when she noticed personnel references that didn't match official military rosters, names that appeared in supply requisitions and weather logs, but not in deployment records. One name appeared repeatedly, Alexei Gromov, listed as NCWR specialist in documents dated 1943. But when she searched official Army records, Gromov appeared only as a weather observer with no combat service. The discrepancy was small, easily dismissible as clerical error. But Dr. Kallistuk was from Unalaska herself. She knew the name. Her grandmother had mentioned an Alexei who'd gone to war and come back silent, who'd died refusing to talk about what he'd done. She spent 3 years following that thread. She found VA psychiatric records showing Alaskan Native veterans treated for conditions classified at extraordinary levels. She discovered supply requisitions for cold weather equipment delivered to units that officially never existed. She interviewed elders in remote villages who remembered recruitment visits in early 1943, family members who'd left for special training and returned damaged and forbidden to speak. Most significantly, she found German military records, captured documents from Norway describing ghost forces operating in winter conditions, unexplained casualties and position abandonments, reports of psychological warfare using methods that German investigators couldn't explain. When she mapped the timing and locations of these reports against the fragmentary evidence of Ranger operations, the correlation was undeniable. What struck me most, Dr. Calistuk said in an academic presentation that was later removed from the conference proceedings, wasn't that this unit existed or even what they did. War creates moral compromises. What disturbed me was the systematic denial of recognition. These men used knowledge that had been suppressed and devalued for generations, knowledge that federal Indian policy had literally tried to erase through boarding schools and assimilation programs. Then, when that knowledge became militarily useful, it was extracted, weaponized, and classified. The men were used and then erased for a second time. The native cold weather rangers represent a question every nation must confront. What do we owe people whose marginalized knowledge becomes temporarily valuable? The easy answer is that wartime necessity justifies any exploitation, that results matter more than methods, that some things must remain secret for national security. But that answer requires accepting that human beings can be treated as resources to be extracted and disposed of when convenient. It requires believing that effectiveness justifies betrayal, that loyalty flows only one direction, and that institutional silence is an acceptable substitute for acknowledgement. The harder answer is that we owe truth. Not glorification, not sanitized heroism, but honest reckoning with what was asked, what was given, and what was taken. We owe recognition that these men weaponized sacred knowledge to serve a nation that had spent generations trying to destroy that knowledge. We owe acknowledgement that their effectiveness came at a cost that was never honestly calculated, because half that cost was immediately hidden. 80 years later, most of the native cold weather rangers are gone. The few surviving family members who know fragments of the story are aging. The institutional memory is fading exactly as designed. But some stories resist erasure. The oral histories persist in communities that understand memory as sacred obligation. The gaps in official records testify to deliberate removal, and researchers continue finding the silences that prove something was taken. This story is one of those silences made audible. It's about warriors who achieved the impossible and were repaid with institutional betrayal. It's about knowledge that was valued only when useful and erased when convenient. It's about the cost of victories we refuse to acknowledge. The native cold weather rangers can't speak for themselves anymore. Most died without ever being allowed to tell their stories, but their silence speaks if we're willing to hear it. It tells us that effectiveness without acknowledgement is exploitation, that winning through methods we refuse to admit is moral cowardice, that the truest cost of war isn't measured in casualties, but in the people we use, break, and forget.